Our own son threw us off a cliff to erase the truth. My husband whispered, "Act dead." Hilda was 60 when she learned how thin the wall can be between family and danger. For most of her life she had believed the two words belonged together, stitched into the same fabric. Love that fed you, protected you, warmed you on winter nights. She and Henry had built that belief year after year, until it felt as permanent as the oak table in their dining room. Their home sat on a quiet suburban loop where mornings smelled of coffee and damp grass. Hilda left early for the elementary school where she taught, her bag full of papers and little rewards for children who tried their best. Henry went to his carpentry shop behind the house, where the air always carried a hint of cedar. His hands, rough from work yet careful in their touch, could turn a plain board into furniture that made people stop and smile. Hit that subscribe button and tap the bell icon so you never miss our latest uploads. They had 2 boys. Richard arrived first, loud with laughter, the kind of child who filled rooms without trying. He carried groceries, begged to stand scrapwood beside his father, and told his mother stories on the walk home as if the world were always slightly brighter than it looked. Damien came 5 years later, quieter, more watchful. He could sit for an hour with a toy in his hands and say nothing, his eyes moving over everything like he was taking notes. Hilda loved them both with the same fierce devotion, the kind that doesn't ask to be earned. Sundays were their anchor. After church they gathered at Henry's table, its edges worn smooth by years of elbows and plates. Richard talked about the future with the confidence of someone who expected doors to open. He wanted to study engineering, to build bridges, to design machines. Damien usually stayed quiet, picking at his food, listening with a face that gave away almost nothing. If Hilda asked what he was thinking, he would shrug and say, "Nothing," as if thoughts were private property. Their life was ordinary, and that was part of its beauty. Henry brought Hilda wildflowers from the roadside. She helped him choose stains for new cabinets. They planned retirement the way people plan small vacations. Someday the ocean, someday a smaller house, someday grandchildren running down the porch steps. For 40 years, she believed they were a team inside a family that, if not perfect, was safe. Then Richard turned 20, and the air in the house shifted in ways Hilda couldn't name. It started with arguments that ended abruptly when she entered a room. She would hear her sons in the hallway, voices low and sharp, and then silence as soon as they noticed her. If she asked what was wrong, Richard would flash a quick smile and say, "Nothing, Mom," while Damien stared at the floor as if the conversation had never happened. Henry told her it was brother stuff. Jealousies, tempers, the kind of friction that came and went. One October night, 25 years before the day she would lie at the bottom of a gorge, Richard didn't come home for dinner. Hilda kept looking at the clock, the hands moving like slow betrayal. At 8 she called his phone and got no answer. At 9 she tried again. By 10 her worry had turned into a tight knot behind her ribs. Henry paced the kitchen, pretending calm for her sake, but his fingers kept rubbing at his ring. Damien stayed in his room, claiming he was studying. When Hilda knocked and asked if he'd heard from his brother, Damien opened the door just enough to show his face and said no, too quickly, as if the answer had been waiting at the tip of his tongue till Henry went outside and started calling Richard's name into the dark. Neighbors joined, flashlights bobbing along streets and into tree lines. Someone called the police. Hilda sat at the table with her hands clasped so tight her knuckles ached, staring at Richard's empty chair as if her gaze could pull him back into it. Just before dawn the search ended at the river gorge, where the land fell away into shadow and water roared below. A deputy approached Henry with his hat in his hands, and Hilda knew from the way Henry's shoulders collapsed that the world had changed shape. Richard had been found at the bottom. The officers spoke in careful words: accident, stumble, dark path, tragic, but Hilda hardly heard them. She heard only the roaring in her own ears, a sound like wind tearing through an empty house. Richard's funeral was the darkest day of her life. She wore the one black dress she owned, as if grief required a uniform. Friends brought casseroles and murmured prayers. Hilda thanked them without remembering their faces. Henry stayed at her side, holding her upright when her knees wanted to fold. Damien stood near the front, still and silent. His eyes were dry. When people hugged him, he accepted it with a strange calm that Hilda could not understand. Not then. After the burial, life didn't return so much as it continued, limping. Hilda went back to teaching because children's problems were small and solvable, and she needed something she could fix. Henry worked in his shop, sanding boards until his arms shook, as if he could grind pain into sawdust. Damien, in the months after Richard's death, changed in a way that nearly fooled Hilda into hope. He became attentive. He offered to do chores without being asked. He lingered near her in the kitchen, asked her how her day went, brought her tea when he noticed she hadn't eaten. Hilda told herself it was grief, guilt, growing up. She told herself families bent but didn't break. Time did what time always does. It covered the sharpest edges. The ache never left, but it dulled enough that Hilda could smile again without feeling guilty. Damien married Melissa, a woman with bright smiles and a voice that sounded sincere. When Melissa called Hilda Mom, it made something in Hilda's chest unclench. The couple had 2 children, and Hilda found herself laughing at sticky hands and bedtime stories, letting herself believe that life, after so much loss, was offering a second chance. 6 months before the mountain trip, Henry and Hilda decided to update their will. It seemed practical. They were both in their 60s. Their bodies had begun to complain in quiet ways. They had saved carefully over decades. Modest savings, a house mostly paid down, a patch of land Hilda had inherited. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough that they wanted it handled with care. Nearly $200,000 when everything was added up. Damien suggested the lawyer first. It's important to have everything in order, he said, sitting in their living room with his hands folded like a responsible man. Melissa nodded beside him, stroking Hilda's hand with a tenderness that felt practiced. We love you, she said. We just want you protected. Hilda tried to take the words at face value. Still, a small alarm rang in her mind, the way it sometimes did when a student's smile didn't match their eyes. The lawyer, Albert, was a family acquaintance, older and careful. He explained options: a trust, equal division, appointing an executor who would distribute funds. Damien leaned forward, calm and confident. He argued that naming him and Melissa as sole heirs would simplify everything. They could handle the grandchildren's future, he said. They could handle Henry and Hilda's care if anything happened. His logic was smooth, and Henry, who hated conflict, nodded more than he questioned. Henry listened with the openness that had always made him kind and, at times, too trusting. Hilda watched Damien's face and tried to read what lived behind it. She remembered Richard's certainty that he would one day help support them. She remembered the whispered arguments. She felt doubt and told herself she was being unfair. Richard was gone. Damien was her only son now. What kind of mother suspected her only remaining child? They signed the papers on a Tuesday afternoon. Melissa wore a green dress and hugged Hilda afterward, whispering, "Now we're united forever." The phrase should have sounded sweet. Instead it left a chill on Hilda's skin, as if someone had brushed past her in a cold hallway. In the weeks that followed, Damien and Melissa visited more often, but their visits had a new texture. They walked through the house with eyes that didn't linger on memories so much as measurements. They talked about renovations, about selling, about smart investments, about life insurance. Melissa suggested they move to a smaller place, more appropriate for their age. Damien's voice sharpened when Hilda resisted. "You're being irrational," he said once, a word he had never used with her before. He talked about stairs and emergencies, but his concern felt like pressure, not care. Henry, practical as ever, started to consider their arguments. He spoke about maintenance costs and property taxes, about how a smaller house might be easier. Hilda felt cornered by the logic, because logic can be used like a rope. At night she lay awake listening to Henry breathe and wondered why her unease refused to fade. When Damien suggested power of attorney over their finances, the knot in her chest tightened. "Just as a precaution," he said, sitting at their kitchen table while Melissa poured tea like she belonged there. The idea was presented like an act of love. Hilda heard something else in it, something hungry. She called Harriet the next day. Her sister listened and then asked, blunt as always, "Why is he so anxious to control your money?" The question landed hard, because it made Hilda admit what she had been avoiding. Damien didn't need their money to live. He had a business. He drove a decent truck. Why did he sound desperate? That afternoon, when Damien visited again, Hilda forced herself to confront him. She asked why he needed so much control when they were still capable. Damien's face tightened, and for a heartbeat she saw a flash of something cold in his eyes, like metal catching light. "It's not control," he said. "It's my responsibility." The words sounded more like a warning than a promise. Melissa added softly, "It hurts to see you worry. Let us help." After they left, Hilda and Henry argued for the first time in years. Henry said she was being paranoid. Hilda said he was being naive. When she mentioned how Damien had seemed different before Richard died, Henry went still in a way that frightened her. The dish he was washing paused mid-scrub, water running over his hands. "Hilda," he said quietly, and the sound of her name felt like a door opening onto a room she hadn't known existed. "There are things about Richard's death I never told you." The kitchen seemed to tilt. Hilda gripped the counter to steady herself. Henry sat at the table and pressed his palms to his eyes, as if he could hold back the past by force. He told her that the night Richard died, Damien hadn't been studying. Henry had seen him leave the house around 8. Something in Damien's mood had bothered him, so he followed at a distance. He heard shouting by the gorge, two voices cutting through the night, Richard's anger and Damien's bitterness. Henry arrived just in time to see Richard lose his footing near the edge, and to see Damien's arm still extended, as if it had been part of the motion. First Henry spoke around it, stumbling over words like a man afraid to name what he'd seen. But the truth pushed its way out of him anyway. Richard, Henry said, had found proof that Damien was taking money from their savings. Richard threatened to tell their parents. Damien panicked, furious that Richard was the oldest, furious that Richard would be believed, furious that his own choices were about to be exposed. "Damien shoved him," Henry whispered, voice breaking. "Not by mistake. He pushed." Hilda felt as if the air had been pulled from the room. Her mind reached for denial, for the comforting official story. Accident, darkness, misstep, but Henry's expression didn't allow it. He told her about Damien's pleading afterward, about the trembling and the tears, about the desperate insistence that it had been an accident. Henry admitted he had chosen to protect his surviving son rather than destroy what was left of their family. He had told himself for years that silence was mercy. He now understood it had been fear dressed up as love. Did he ever pay it back? Hilda asked, though she already knew. Henry shook his head. "And Melissa?" Hilda whispered. "Does she know?" Henry's silence answered. When Damien called the next day with an enthusiastic plan, a family hike in the mountains to celebrate their anniversary, Hilda felt her blood turn cold. The invitation was wrapped in sweetness, but underneath she heard the same hard edge Henry had just exposed. She looked at her husband, and he looked back, and without speaking they understood the same thing. The mountains were not a gift. They were a stage. That night Hilda lay awake, hearing not the hum of their familiar neighborhood but the roar of the gorge in her memory, the echo of Richard's missing footsteps, and the quiet certainty that the ordinary life she had trusted was gone. Henry tried to speak as if he were offering simple facts, but the confession kept turning into pain. He told her how Damien had clung to his arm and begged, voice cracking, "Dad, please. You can't lose me too." Henry had heard those words and, in that moment, his fear of losing another child had outweighed everything else. Truth, justice, even Hilda's right to know. He had carried that choice like a stone for 25 years. Hilda listened with her hands on the table, feeling as if the wood might splinter under the weight of what she was hearing. Richard hadn't simply been taken by bad luck. He had been taken by the boy she had raised. And Henry, the man who held her through every storm, had been holding back a storm of his own. "What do we do now?" she asked. Henry swallowed. "We have to be careful," he said. "If Damien thinks we're going to talk, he won't wait. We need proof, something that can't be argued away." Hilda thought of the will papers, the pressure, the way Melissa's eyes had measured their house. She wanted to call the police and say Richard's name to someone who would write it down, who would make it real. But Henry's guilt was a chain around both of them. If he spoke, he risked losing everything, his freedom, his reputation, the peace they had. And then Damien called again, as if their silence had summoned him, his voice cheerful. "Next weekend," he said. "We'll all go together. You and Dad deserve something special." Hilda held the phone and heard, beneath the brightness, a decision already made. Damien arrived early the morning they were supposed to leave, as if eagerness could disguise intention. The sun had barely cleared the rooftops, and frost still clung to the edges of the lawn when his truck pulled into the driveway. Hilda watched from behind the curtain, her stomach tight, her hands cold despite the warmth of the kitchen. Melissa stepped out of the passenger side holding a canvas tote, smiling like a woman arriving for a picnic instead of a reckoning. Damien waved toward the window, bright and casual, and Hilda forced herself to wave back. Henry moved slowly around the house, checking ordinary things with a carefulness that wasn't ordinary at all. He lifted a cushion on the sofa and tucked his phone under it, then pulled it out again, testing the screen, the battery, the tiny red that meant it was recording. He slid it into an inside pocket of his jacket, the fabric thick enough to hide the shape, and then he looked at Hilda as if he wanted to say 100 things. He said none of them. He only reached for her hand and held it for a moment longer than usual. When Damien and Melissa entered, they brought with them the smell of cold air and something else, an energy like a room where people have rehearsed lines. Melissa hugged Hilda and kissed her cheek. Her perfume was sweet and familiar, and the familiarity made Hilda's throat tighten. Damien clapped Henry on the shoulder as if they were two men about to share a harmless adventure. "Ready?" he asked, and his smile was confident, practiced, aimed at hiding whatever lived beneath it. Breakfast felt like theater. Damien talked about the route, about how easy it was, about how the trail ended at a lookout with a view of the whole valley. Melissa described her new camera, lifting it from her bag and showing it off with the delighted enthusiasm of someone who wanted memories. Hilda listened and nodded and tried to keep her face soft. She watched their eyes when they thought she wasn't looking. Damien's gaze slid over the cabinets, the framed family photos, the carved table Henry had made. It didn't linger with affection. It skimmed like a hand over items in a store. Hilda had always believed she could read her son, that she knew the difference between his quiet moods and his stubborn streaks. Now she realized how much of him had always been behind a door she never opened. He asked Henry if he'd packed warm gloves. He asked Hilda if she'd brought water. He spoke like a caretaker. But every question was a checkmark on an internal list. They loaded the truck. Damien had purchased gear, ropes, a first aid kit, headlamps. Hilda stared at the bundle of rope and felt the world tilt a little. Henry's fingers brushed her wrist, a small signal. Remember the phone. Remember the plan. The drive to the mountains took 2 hours, long enough for Hilda to cycle through every possible outcome. Melissa played cheerful music and sang quietly along, her voice light. Damien drove carefully, stopping fully at every sign, keeping exactly to the speed limit. The carefulness was almost worse than recklessness. It felt like he was preserving the shape of the day, protecting the illusion he would later present. Hilda pictured a police officer asking, were they being unsafe? And Damien answering, sincerely offended, of course not. I did everything right. Henry sat beside her in the back seat, their bodies close but not touching too obviously. Once when Damien and Melissa laughed at something on the radio, Henry leaned in and whispered, so low Hilda could barely hear, if anything happens, do what I say. Even if it feels impossible. Hilda nodded without looking at him, her eyes on the passing road, her heart beating too loud in her own ears. To the trailhead the air was thinner and colder. The forest rose around them, tall trees with needles that softened sound. A river ran somewhere nearby, steady and indifferent. Hilda stepped out and inhaled, tasting pine, and felt a brief, bitter irony. This was the kind of place she'd once dreamed of visiting with her family. The kind of place she would have called beautiful without hesitation. Now beauty looked like a trap. Melissa took pictures immediately, of the trail sign, of the trees, of Henry adjusting his jacket. "Smile," she said, and the word landed on Hilda like an instruction in a language she no longer spoke. Damien shouldered his backpack and said, "Let's go," with the crispness of someone starting a job. The trail began easy enough, a packed path winding through ferns and moss. Melissa walked a few steps ahead, turning often to snap photos, pointing out wildflowers, making delighted noises. Damien stayed a few steps behind Henry and Hilda, the way a protective son might. But Hilda felt his presence like pressure against her back. Every so often he asked, "You okay, Mom? Need a break?" His voice was warm, but his eyes were measuring something. Pace, breath, fatigue. After half an hour, Hilda's legs began to ache. She was not a woman who hiked. She walked around town, around her yard, around school hallways. This was different. Henry's breathing grew louder, and she saw the tension in his jaw as he pushed through discomfort without complaint. Damien noticed everything, and Hilda realized the exhaustion was part of it. If the body was tired enough, the mind would follow. Melissa pointed to a bend in the trail where the trees thinned. "We're almost there," she announced brightly. Hilda knew enough from Damien's earlier map talk to doubt it. Almost there meant whatever they had chosen was close. Not the official lookout, not the advertised destination. Something else. The path grew steeper, loose gravel sliding underfoot. Hilda gripped a branch once and felt bark bite her palm. Henry stumbled slightly, caught himself. Damien's hand shot out fast. Too fast, steadying Henry as if he'd been waiting for that exact moment. "Careful," Damien said, and the word held a warning beneath it. Hilda tried to memorize landmarks. A split boulder, a leaning pine, a patch of yellow flowers. She tried to force her mind to stay sharp, to store details as if she were preparing a lesson plan. She thought, "If I live, I will need to explain. If I live, I will need to point." Melissa stopped at a junction where a narrower path broke off toward the right. It looked less traveled, rougher, and it angled upward toward exposed rock. She lifted her camera and turned with a bright smile. "Oh wow," she said, as if she'd just discovered it by chance. "Look at that. There's a cliff up there with the most incredible view. Let's go up for a few pictures." Hilda's body reacted before her mind could form words. Her hands went cold. Her stomach dropped. She looked at Henry, and Henry's face confirmed what she already felt. This was it. Not the official lookout with other hikers. Not a place where someone might pass. A side path to a high edge. "I don't think that's a good idea," Hilda said, forcing her voice to stay light. "That looks dangerous." Damien laughed softly, the way he used to laugh when he was younger and trying to coax her into saying yes to something. "Mom," he said, "it's fine. It's just a quick climb. We'll be right there with you. You'll love it. The photos will be amazing." The word amazing sounded like it had teeth. Melissa nodded, eyes wide with staged excitement. "Come on," she said. "We'll help you. It'll be so special." Henry squeezed Hilda's hand once, discreetly, and she felt the hard rectangle of his phone through his jacket. The recording was still running. Their only lifeline was evidence, because instinct alone had no weight in a courtroom. Hilda swallowed and nodded as if she'd been convinced. "All right," she said softly. "Just slow." The climb was worse than the trail. The ground shifted. Loose stones skittered downhill when their boots pressed too hard. The trees thinned, offering fewer things to grab. Hilda's heart hammered in her chest, not just from exertion but from the certainty that the path had been chosen because it was unforgiving. Henry's breath came in harsh pulls. Damien moved with a controlled ease, stepping carefully, offering a hand, playing the perfect guide. Melissa climbed ahead and turned to snap photos of them, struggling adorably. As if it were all part of a fun family story. To the top, the world opened into a wide view. The valley stretched below, ridges layered in the distance, the river flashing between trees. If Hilda had been here in another life, she would have cried from how large it all felt. Now she saw only the edge, the sudden drop, the way the ground ended without mercy. Melissa moved close to the rim and lifted her camera. "Over here," she called. "Stand right here, the background is perfect." Hilda's mouth went dry. She and Henry approached slowly, each step heavy. Damien drifted behind them, positioning himself with a casualness that was too deliberate. Hilda could almost feel the geometry of it. Melissa in front with the camera, Damien behind as the force, Henry and Hilda as the bodies that would be moved. Melissa snapped a few pictures. "Closer," she said. "A little closer to the edge so we can see the whole valley." Henry's hand tightened around Hilda's, and for an instant she thought he might refuse, might turn and shout, might do something dramatic. But Henry only whispered, barely audible, "Stay calm." They moved, one careful step, then another, until Hilda could feel open air behind her heels. The edge was closer than she wanted to believe. Melissa adjusted her camera. Her smile changed. It wasn't a warm smile anymore. It was a thin line, the expression of someone done pretending. She didn't say anything at first. She only looked through the viewfinder as if framing a picture she'd already imagined many times. Then, without lifting her face, she said softly, "This is going to be the last one." The sentence didn't sound like a joke. It landed like a verdict. Damien moved. It happened fast, but not frantic. It was the kind of movement Hilda had seen in her classroom when a child decided to knock over another child's tower and wanted it to look accidental. A quick lunge, hands out, a shove timed to the moment when someone was off balance. Hilda felt the pressure at her back and the sudden terror of weight shifting into emptiness. Henry reacted, not with panic but with a fierce, desperate clarity. His arm shot out and caught Damien's wrist. Henry yanked forward, pulling Damien with him. For a heartbeat all four of them were tangled at the brink, Hilda and Henry leaning backward, Damien dragged forward, Melissa stepping in with a startled gasp. Hilda felt the ground crumble under a boot, small stones tumbling away. The world narrowed to sensation, Henry's grip, Damien's weight, the sharp cold of the air, Melissa's short scream. And then the edge took them. The fall was not a long memory in Hilda's mind afterward, because the mind protects itself by slicing away what it can't bear. She remembered the wind in her ears. She remembered her own voice, not as words but as sound. She remembered thinking, in a strange clear flash, of Richard at 20 angry and certain, and how he must have felt in the moment his life stopped being his. When they hit, pain flooded her so completely it became almost abstract, like fire filling a room. Her body slammed against hard ground, and for an instant she believed that was the end, that the world would go dark and she would float away from everything. But it didn't. Somewhere through the shock, she heard Henry's voice. Not loud. Not dramatic. A whisper shaped by survival. "Hilda," he breathed, and the sound of her name cut through the chaos like a rope thrown to someone drowning. "Don't move. Play dead." The instruction made no sense at first. Everything in her wanted to gasp, to cry out, to reach for him, to scream for help. But Henry's whisper carried a certainty that reached her deeper than pain. Hilda forced herself still. She flattened herself into the ground as if her body could become part of it. She controlled her breathing, shallow and tiny, and kept her eyes closed even though her lids wanted to fly open. Nearby, someone groaned. Another voice, sharper with fear. Damien's. Melissa's. They were alive too. Hilda listened, trapped inside her own body, counting heartbeats the way she used to count children in a classroom on a field trip. She heard Damien shift, scraping against rock. She heard Melissa whimper, angry and frightened. "My leg," Melissa said, voice strained. "It hurts." Damien cursed under his breath and then, with effort, dragged himself closer. Hilda felt vibration through the ground as he moved. He stopped near her. She could sense him hovering, and the terror that he might notice her breathing made her blood feel like ice. He spoke after a moment, his voice steadier than it should have been for someone injured. "They're gone," he said, and in those two words Hilda heard not grief but relief. "Both of them." Melissa exhaled, and the sound that followed was something between a laugh and a sigh. "Finally," she whispered. We don't have to pretend anymore. Hilda wanted to open her eyes and look at them, to confirm with sight what her ears already knew. But she stayed still, every muscle trembling with effort. Henry's whisper echoed in her mind. Play dead. Damien began speaking as if rehearsing lines. We stick to the story, he said to Melissa. We were taking pictures, Dad slipped, Mom tried to help, and he cut himself off with another grim breath. We fell too. We're the unlucky survivors. Melissa made a sound of agreement. We practiced, she murmured. We just have to sell it. Hilda lay there and realized, with a cold clarity that turned her stomach, that this hadn't been a moment of sudden madness. This had been planned, practiced, repeated in conversations she'd never heard. Their voices slowly moved away, the scraping of their bodies against rock and dirt fading as they tried to crawl toward a place where a phone might work. Hilda waited until she could no longer hear them clearly. Only then did she let herself shift the smallest amount, a microscopic movement that sent pain lancing through her shoulder. She bit down on the inside of her cheek to keep from making a sound. Henry whispered again, close enough now that she knew he was alive. Are you with me? He asked, voice thin. Hilda tried to answer, but even a whisper felt like it tore at her ribs. Still, she forced it out. Yes, she breathed. I'm here. Henry's exhale sounded like relief and agony tangled together. No signal, he whispered. I checked. We have to wait. But we're alive. That matters. Hilda stared into darkness behind closed eyes and tried to hold on to his words. Alive. The simplest miracle. The only chance. And somewhere above them, in the cold mountain air, the story Damien and Melissa would soon tell was already forming. A tragic accident, an unlucky slip, grieving survivors. Hilda knew that if she didn't find a way to break that story, it would become the truth everyone believed, though she lay still, listening to the faint sounds of rescue beginning far away, and she promised herself something she had never promised before. If she got another chance to speak, she would not protect the illusion of family at the cost of reality. She would tell the world what her son was. And she would say Richard's name out loud, where it could no longer be buried. Hilda lay in the cold shadow of the gorge, every sensation sharpened by pain and fear. The ground beneath her was uneven, pressing jagged angles into her back. Each breath felt like glass sliding through her ribs, but she kept it shallow, controlled, almost invisible. Henry lay a short distance away, close enough that she could sense his presence, far enough that she couldn't reach him without risking discovery. The silence between them was heavy, broken only by distant echoes and the slow rush of blood in her ears. Time stretched strangely. Minutes felt like hours, hours like something without shape at all. Hilda's thoughts wandered despite her efforts to keep them anchored. She thought of her classroom, of the way children sometimes pretended not to hear instructions, hoping chaos would resolve itself. She thought of Richard, of his laugh, of the way he used to stand too close to the edge of things because he trusted the world to hold him. She thought of Damien as a boy, small hands clutching toy cars, eyes already too watchful for his age. She wondered when the line had been crossed, when quiet had turned into something darker. Above them, faint voices drifted through the gorge, distorted by distance and rock. At first Hilda couldn't tell if they were Damien and Melissa or someone else. Her heart stuttered each time a sound echoed, unsure whether it meant danger or rescue. Henry shifted slightly and hissed in pain before catching himself. He went still again, and Hilda's fingers curled into the dirt, resisting the urge to reach for him. Eventually, the voices became clearer. Not Damien's rehearsed calm. Not Melissa's strained whisper. These voices were brisk, purposeful, layered with urgency. Rescue workers. Hilda felt a flicker of hope so sharp it hurt. But hope was dangerous. If Damien and Melissa were with them, if they controlled the story, rescue could become another stage in the performance. Henry's whisper came again, barely audible. They're coming, he said. Remember, don't move until we're sure. Hilda gave the smallest possible response, a tiny shift of her fingers against the ground, the signal they had agreed on in that desperate moment. She could hear ropes being secured, metal clinking softly. Someone shouted coordinates. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness briefly, skimming past her face. She kept her eyes closed, her body slack, summoning every ounce of discipline she had ever used in her life. A rescuer reached her first. She felt hands at her neck, fingers searching for a pulse. The touch was professional, gentle. Very faint, a voice said. She's alive, but barely. Relief flooded her so strongly she nearly cried out. She didn't. She stayed still. Another rescuer moved to Henry. We've got a man here too, someone said. Critical, but breathing. Above them, Damien's voice carried down, cracked with practiced grief. That's my parents, he called. Please, please help them. Hilda felt a surge of anger so intense it almost broke her control. Even now, he was performing. Even now, he was lying. She held still as rescuers worked around her, securing her to a stretcher, fitting an oxygen mask over her face. The mask smelled of plastic and air, and she focused on that smell, letting it ground her as they lifted her. Pain flared white-hot through her shoulder and leg, but she forced herself not to react. She was dimly aware of being hoisted upward, of the darkness shifting as they moved. Somewhere nearby, Henry was being lifted too. She wanted to speak his name, to tell him she was still here, but she waited. The timing mattered. Everything mattered. At the top, the noise changed. Radios crackled. Footsteps moved more quickly. Hilda heard Melissa sobbing, loud and dramatic. Someone murmured words of comfort to her. Damien's voice wove through the sounds, steadying, explaining. It happened so fast, he said. We tried to grab them. We fell too. Hilda was placed onto a stretcher near Henry. She could sense him beside her, hear the uneven rhythm of his breathing. The rescue team moved efficiently, loading them into a helicopter. The whir of the blades grew loud, swallowing sound and thought alike. The vibration shook her body, jarring injuries she couldn't yet fully understand. In the helicopter, paramedics spoke in clipped sentences. Blood pressure low. Possible fractures. Stay with us. Hilda kept her eyes closed, letting them believe she was drifting. She felt hands adjust 4 lines, and heard the beep of monitors. She focused on staying conscious enough to remember. To think. The hospital lights were blinding when they arrived. Hilda's stretcher rolled through corridors filled with movement and sound. She was moved into a room, surrounded by people who spoke quickly and confidently. Her injuries were assessed, stabilized. Pain medication flowed into her veins, dulling the edges but not erasing awareness. She held on to consciousness with stubborn determination. At some point, the room grew quieter. Hilda sensed a presence near her bed that felt wrong. She recognized the rhythm of Damien's breathing before she heard his voice. "Mom," he whispered, leaning close. "If you can hear me, I'm so sorry. I love you." His words slid over her like oil. She didn't move. Melissa appeared on the other side, her voice trembling with what sounded like grief. "You were always so good to us," she murmured. "We'll take care of everything." Then Damien leaned closer still, and his voice dropped. "You should have let things go," he whispered. "Some questions don't need answers." Hilda felt something shift inside her, not fear, not pain, but resolve. She remained still, but she knew then that if she lived, she would not be silent again. The footsteps retreated. The room settled. A nurse lingered, checking monitors. Hilda sensed her hesitation, the way she paused as if something didn't add up. When the nurse leaned close, her voice low, Hilda took a risk. She moved one finger. Just once. The nurse froze. Her breath caught. "Ma'am," she whispered, barely audible. "Can you hear me?" Hilda moved her finger again, twice this time. Understanding flickered across the nurse's face. She glanced toward the door, then back at Hilda. "You're not safe, are you?" she murmured. Hilda summoned every bit of strength she had and moved her finger 3 times. The nurse straightened, her expression hardening with purpose. "Stay still," she whispered. "I'm getting help." When she returned, she wasn't alone. A doctor followed, along with 2 police officers. The room felt different then, anchored, protected. One of the officers spoke gently. "Ma'am, if you can hear me, we need to know what really happened." Hilda opened her eyes. The words came slowly at first, her throat raw, her voice thin. But they came. She told them about the push, about the planning, about Richard. She told them about the recording Henry had made, about the lies that had lived in her home for decades. The officers listened without interruption, their expressions grave. Henry was brought in shortly after, pale but conscious. When he confirmed her story and handed over his phone, the weight of 25 years lifted from his shoulders in a visible way. He looked at Hilda, eyes wet and mouthed, "I'm sorry." She squeezed his hand, careful of the tubes and bruises. "We're here," she whispered back. "That's what matters." The arrests happened quietly. Damien and Melissa were taken into custody without spectacle, their shock quickly turning into accusation and blame. Hilda didn't watch. She lay back against a pillow, exhaustion washing over her, and let the sound of their voices fade into the distance. In the days that followed, the truth spread like light into dark corners. Investigators listened to recordings. Bank records were examined. Stories were untangled. Each fact reinforced what Hilda had already accepted. The danger had been real, the betrayal deliberate. Recovery was slow. Bodies healed more easily than trust. But Hilda found strength in small things. In Henry's presence, in the kindness of strangers, in the certainty that Richard's story would finally be told honestly. When she was strong enough, she gave her statement again, this time with steadier breath. She spoke not as a victim, but as a witness. She said her son's name without flinching. She said the truth without apology. And in doing so, she reclaimed something she had lost long before the mountain, the right to see clearly, and to speak without fear. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm of pain management, paperwork, and quiet reckonings. Hilda woke and slept in measured intervals, her body learning again how to exist without screaming at every movement. Henry recovered beside her, slower, his injuries deeper, but his spirit steadier than it had been in years. In the sterile calm of the hospital, with monitors humming and nurses moving in soft shoes, they spoke more honestly than they had in decades. Detectives came and went. They asked careful questions, the kind meant to build a structure strong enough to hold in court. Hilda answered each one, even when her voice shook, even when the memories pressed too hard against her chest. She learned that truth, once spoken, had a weight and a steadiness of its own. It didn't make the pain disappear, but it kept the pain from swallowing her whole. Henry gave his statement too. He did not spare himself. He spoke about the night at the gorge 25 years earlier, about the choice he had made to protect one child at the expense of truth. He spoke with tears on his cheeks and relief in his posture, as if confession had unlocked something that had been rusted shut inside him. The officers listened without judgment. They wrote everything down. They thanked him for his honesty. For the first time since Richard's death, Henry slept without waking in a sweat. The recordings from Henry's phone became the backbone of the case. Hilda listened to parts of them once, then asked not to hear them again. She didn't need to hear Damien's voice rehearsing lies, Melissa's cool planning, the casual cruelty of words meant to justify murder. She knew their sound too well already. News traveled quickly through the small town. People brought flowers and casseroles again, just as they had years ago, but this time the murmurs were different. There was shock, disbelief, sympathy layered with something darker. Fear. Neighbors looked at Hilda and Henry with wide eyes, as if trying to reconcile the people they knew with the story unfolding in the papers. Hilda accepted their kindness without explanation. She had learned that she did not owe anyone the neatness of her pain. Harriet arrived with arms open and questions unasked. She stayed for hours at a time, sitting at Hilda's bedside, holding her hand, listening. When Hilda spoke about Richard, Harriet cried openly. "I always wondered," she said softly. "I just didn't want to be right." The grandchildren were harder. Social services placed them temporarily with a foster family while the investigation moved forward. Hilda thought of them constantly, Their voices, their questions, the way they had called her grandma and believed it meant safety. The thought that they were confused and frightened cut deeper than any physical injury. Hilda asked the detective what would happen to them. "They're safe," he said. "And when you're ready, you can apply for custody." When Hilda and Henry were finally discharged, they returned to a house that felt both familiar and strange. Dust lay where it always had, sunlight fell through the same windows, but the silence had changed. The lies that once filled the space were gone, leaving a hollow that felt raw and honest. Hilda moved slowly through each room, touching objects like artifacts, Richard's old books, Henry's tools, photos of a family that had been real and unreal at the same time. The trial took months to begin. In that time, Hilda learned how to live with scars. Physical therapy became part of her routine. Henry practiced walking without his crutches, grimacing but determined. They talked about the future in small, careful sentences. Not dreams yet. Just facts. Appointments. Court dates. The children. When the trial finally came, Hilda felt as if she were walking into a storm she had already survived. The courtroom was colder than she expected, the air thick with anticipation. Damien sat at the defense table, his posture composed, his face unreadable. Melissa sat beside him, eyes downcast, hands folded as if in prayer. For a fleeting moment, Hilda felt the old reflex, to see her son as someone who needed protection. The reflex faded as quickly as it came. Hilda took the stand. She spoke clearly, steadily, telling the story not as a spectacle but as a sequence of truths. She described the pressure over the will, the hike, the push, the fall. She spoke Richard's name and watched the jury listen. When the defense tried to frame the events as panic, desperation, misunderstanding, Hilda held her ground. "They practiced," she said simply. "They planned. That is not panic." Henry testified after her. His voice trembled at first, then grew stronger as he spoke. He took responsibility for his silence, named it for what it was. The courtroom was quiet when he finished, the kind of quiet that means people are thinking. When the verdict came, guilty, Hilda felt no triumph. Only a heavy exhale, as if a long-held breath had finally been released. The sentences were severe. Life, with no promise of release. The judge spoke of betrayal, of trust violated beyond repair. Damien did not look at Hilda. Melissa wept, loudly, until her lawyer placed a hand on her arm. Afterward, Hilda sat with Henry on a wooden bench outside the courthouse. The sky was wide and blue, indifferent to human justice. "Do you feel different?" Henry asked. "Yes," Hilda said after a moment. "Lighter. Sadder. Both." They began the process of bringing the grandchildren home slowly, with patience and care. Social workers visited. Paperwork piled up. The children arrived with small bags and big questions. Hilda and Henry answered what they could honestly and gently. "Your parents made very bad choices," Hilda said. "You are not those choices." She said it again and again, until the children began to believe it tonight. Hilda told them about Richard. Not the terrible ending, but the man he had been. The laughter, the kindness, the way he had wanted to build things that helped people cross from one place to another. She told them because memory, she had learned, was a bridge too. Sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, Hilda thought about the cliff, the fall, the whisper that had saved her life. She thought about how close she had come to never speaking again. And then she listened to the soft breathing of children in nearby rooms, to Henry's steady presence beside her, and she understood something she hadn't before. Family, she realized, was not defined by blood alone, nor destroyed by betrayal. It was defined by truth, by protection that did not demand silence, by love that did not require blindness. She had lost much. She had nearly lost everything. But she was still here. And this time, she would never look away. Life did not return to normal, because normal had been built on things that were no longer there. Instead, a new rhythm emerged. Quieter, slower, more deliberate. Hilda discovered that survival was not a single event, but a long series of choices made after the danger had passed. Each morning she woke with stiffness in her bones and a heaviness in her chest, but also with a certainty she had never known before. The truth was no longer something that waited in the shadows. It lived in the open now, where it could be seen and named. The grandchildren adapted in the way children often do, hesitantly at first, then with surprising resilience. There were nights when one of them woke crying from dreams they could not explain, and Hilda would sit on the edge of the bed, rubbing small backs, humming the same lullaby she had once sung to her own sons. She never lied, but she learned how to choose her words carefully. She spoke of safety, of love, of the fact that grown-ups sometimes fail in terrible ways, and that none of it was the children's fault. Henry took on the role of quiet anchor. He built small things again in his workshop, not furniture for sale, but objects with purpose. A bookshelf for the children's room, a sturdy bench for the yard. Each piece carried a kind of apology in its careful construction, a promise that his hands would now be used only to build, never to hide. Hilda returned to teaching part-time when her body allowed it. The classroom felt different after everything she had been through. She noticed fear more quickly in her students, recognized silence not as emptiness but as something that might be hiding pain. She listened more. She intervened sooner. She no longer assumed that time alone would fix what was broken. Some evenings, after the children were asleep, Hilda and Henry sat on the porch and talked about Richard. They let his memory breathe without choking on it. They spoke of the boy he had been, not just the tragedy he had become. They allowed themselves to grieve him fully at last, without the weight of secrets pressing their words flat. There were moments when guilt crept in, when Hilda wondered how she had missed the signs, how love had blinded her for so long. In those moments, Henry reminded her gently, "We loved our children. That was never the wrong thing." And she learned to accept that love, while powerful, did not grant her the ability to see every truth in time. The house slowly filled with new sounds, laughter during dinner, arguments over homework, the thump of feet on stairs. It was not the life she had imagined years ago, but it was a life rooted in honesty. And that, she learned, mattered more than perfection ever had done on anniversaries. Of the fall, of the trial, of Richard's death, Hilda allowed herself quiet reflection. She walked the familiar trail near town, not the mountains, just the gentle loop where she and Henry had once dreamed of the future. She walked not to forget, but to remember that she was still moving forward. Hilda no longer believed that families were automatically safe. She believed they had to be made safe again and again, with truth and courage. She taught her grandchildren that questions were allowed, that silence was never owed, that love should never require fear. And when people asked her how she had survived, how she had endured betrayal so deep it nearly ended her life, she answered simply, "I stopped protecting the lie." That was the lesson she carried with her now, the one she passed on quietly, daily, in the way she lived.